Patrick, what is it about collage that you find so compelling? Because it's turned up in other of your work, and it certainly is in this show as well.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Robert. Well, you mentioned collage, and certainly I think that it comes from a number of different sources or backdrops. And one of them certainly has to do with my printmaking background. And the fact that when you do printmaking, you're dealing with a series of steps or something that's quite incremental. But some of the steps really are in a certain sense, you might say, counterintuitive to thinking about images. So you need to draw on a stone, for example, and then you need to deal with chemistry and go through a whole series of stages that involve real technology that has very little to do with what we ultimately see on the wall of the gallery or in a book. And so I think that sense of a kind of living bricolage or an active process of putting together is part of what probably has infiltrated my work in terms of the use of collage. I think the other thing is that collage really does draw on, especially inferentially with its history of Picasso and Braque, it deals with picture making in what we think of as the fine art tradition, but it also deals with the everyday, drawing materials from around us. And I think that as an artist who's interested in the social, but also interested in the space of the gallery as a place that we can really do some interesting work, I think collage can be a kind of optimal medium, kind of simultaneously really embracing the world of the gallery and also the world beyond it. So I think it's a sort of both and situation in that regard.
It's interesting that collage as a pictorial device is complicated because it's both, and you mentioned Picasso and Braque. For them, it was a kind of medium of reconstruction, of putting the world together again. But it can also be one of visual rupture. And I wonder how, within that spectrum, the work that you've got in the show, where does it fit inside that framework?
Well, I think it probably does embrace the idea of rupture insofar as some of the images that I'm using, certainly the images of nature that come from the 19th century graphic arts illustrated manual, certainly they represent a kind of image of nature that we know is in effect troubled. They certainly also remind us of the beauty of nature, and I think you can still find those images quite beautiful. But the need for a rupture there, I think in what I'm doing, is a recognition that these images are still doing some work. But I, as an artist, need to actually draw attention, both directly and indirectly, to, in essence, the fact that they no longer exist, we could say, as a kind of untroubled or sort of unquestioned world. So I would say that there's a kind of troubling that collage is doing there. That said, certainly a lot of what I actually do with my work it harkens to, we could say, decorative art, even sometimes quilt making. So in that sense, I think some of the collage work really is not purely about troubling, but it's also about remaking. It's about, in essence, maybe sort of making beautiful with something that we might have dismissed, for example.
It's interesting to talk about the work from the point of view of what's there. There's also something that isn't there. And I think of the work as being haunted by a certain kind of absence. You mentioned the Aldine and the images coming out of the 19th century. There's a kind of idealized notion of Hudson River landscapes there. But what's not in those images, of course, are Indigenous people. The other absence, in some sense, in the show is the loss of your close friend, which is also part of the emotional texture of the show itself. So I wonder how you're handling this question, or how you address this question of the kind of doubled or layered absence in the show.
Yeah, I think the question of absence is really important. And in one of the small collages that I made really quite early on in the process, I was cutting out the little images of animals and moving them around. And as you say, there were no images fundamentally of Indigenous. So I recognized that. And in kind of cutting out and displacing these images of animals, at one point I referred to the title of one of the pieces as a ghost dog. So there's this kind of recognition of presence and absence in an overt way in that work. But then I think there's this other we could say, sense of absence that I'm interested in and preoccupied with that has come into some of the work, insofar as when I started making these structures that look a little bit like, you could say, satellites or some kind of device that might relate to communication. It was with this idea of questioning how we make contact or how we reach across. And I mean, in the case of the friend of mine who had died, it was a fairly literal kind of question around, am I ever going to be able to speak with her again? But, there's so many ways in which I think in art, we actually show something in order to draw attention to what's not there. And so in essence, I think in this exhibition and in some of this work, that wasn't necessarily a conscious preoccupation. But I think, as you know, Robert, when an artwork gets made, a lot of it is about what can be taken away so that something can really be said. And so I think that is also about a kind of productive absence making.
I like the way you talk about your work in sort of talking and writing about, you use the wonderful phrase, a constellation of failures that you're addressing in some ways. And you talk about modernism, you talk about our stewardship of the environment. But this whole question of what you call the ruin of images struck me, because the ruin of images as a phrase has a rich and kind of romantic sensibility operating. And the romantic sensibility is one in which it tries to salvage from our ruined world something aspirational, something hopeful. I wonder how your notion of the ruin of images fits into the way in which this work is read by people.
Right. I've been thinking about this a little bit more, and I was thinking actually that probably that whole notion of ruin and ruin is Benjaminian. So Walter Benjamin certainly gave us lots of cues as to how we might think about that and how we might think about history. I think in my case, I'm really interested in that kind of backward looking in order to look forward. But I think I'm also interested, and maybe it has something to do with our context in North America. I'm also interested in the way that our settler image history, and I'm not thinking so much about our fine art history, but some of the image history around how we've represented landscape and who gets represented in landscape really is not particularly long. But when you actually look at what it's showing us, it actually does involve telling us a story which actually has lots of pain and failures within it. And so I think that the kind of ruin that I'm talking about is about actually doing an examination, and in essence, it's really not about trying to kind of reprise or revitalize these images. It really is about recognizing that they have work that they're still doing, and I may have said this already, they have work that they're still doing, and that we need to somehow participate in that work critically. And I think that certainly, we're part of a culture and we're part of many cultures. And I think that, it's important that we take responsibility effectively for the kinds of culture we've made and the kind of culture we continue to make.
In this body of work and others, you've talked about the question of the sort of difficulty of representation. And as I'm thinking about your work in this show and in other bodies of work of yours, I know, I've always had a sense that your interest is in something that is more elusive than conclusive, that there's a kind of instability or unfixedness about your work. And I wonder how you react to that idea. I guess I'm really asking a larger question about, is this just a quotidian reflection of how the world is, that is, it's changing and hard to get a hold of, or is there something more deeply philosophical about the way in which the human condition operating in your sense of the elusive?
Well, I would like to say there's something more deeply philosophical. I probably am not the best one to judge that. I would say that I do, as an artist and probably as a person, I tend to be a fairly divergent thinker. And so, and that may also come from having been a teacher for a long time as well. So, I really do want to kind of represent the breadth of, or think about the breadth of reality and the complexity of the world in which we're living and the various sides of the coin. And there's more than two. So that sense of being interested in divergence, I think it leads me as an artist often to try to, in essence, envelop the viewer in a fairly complex environment where there's more questions than answers, certainly. And I think that, that can actually work fairly well. But I do know that many artists try to sort of narrow down what they do. And we certainly have a long history of that. But I think that, my interest is in a sense, pointing back to the viewer, and that might sound like a cop-out, but pointing back to the viewer and asking them to include themselves in the situation, in the picture. And so maybe that is one of the sort of benefits of, I guess, what we could call installation, because some of that happens in my work for sure.
In your work as well, I mean, you also aid our inability to sort of see clearly, and that, for instance, in the Messenger's landscapes, you occlude over a direct apprehension of the image. Is that a sort of strategy of interference in some ways that helps the viewer not see what's there and suggests a kind of layering and complexity in the visual image?
Yeah, I think that's a good reading. With those works, I began with these quite small images from this 19th century catalog called the Aldine. Eventually enlarged them and had them printed on large-scale Japanese paper. And so there was a kind of process that I got involved in that, I certainly, you could say I know what I'm doing insofar as I know what I'm interested in doing as an artist, but I certainly don't always know where it's leading. And in that case, I think the introduction of punching holes in grids and that sort of thing, it was a fairly, I don't want to say unquestioned, but a fairly direct engagement with, you could say, modernist kinds of strategies, with strategies that really, I think, do bring up a number of ways of thinking about building up a layered sort of image or taking away layers in order to create an image. And I think by doing that, there's the inferential sense that this image can become a field, we could say, for something else. Now, the something else might actually be something that literally troubles or problematizes what's in the image, but the something else might be something that is almost a veil in front of it. And maybe we could say that in some cases, what I'm doing is creating a kind of a veil of the modern to really sort of put both of these things in a tension, in an overt tension. So it's not really about making a kind of melange, but it really is about showing a kind of difference.
Mm-hmm. That's a lovely idea, the veil of the modern. Your work is you put a lot of care into it. That is, it's careful, full of care. Mm-hmm. And you also talk about wanting to make work that purports to be both beautiful and harmonious. You want to talk to me a little bit about what you mean by these big words, beauty and harmony? They're kind of loaded conceptions about art making.
Right. Well, I have thought quite a lot about beauty at various stages, and certainly at earlier stages, I thought about beauty, in relation to its kind of troubled status in contemporary art and in the modern, and and really sometimes as a kind of counterpoint, I guess, to the sublime, those kinds of things. So I did go through a fair amount of thinking and I guess we could say analysis around beauty. But ultimately, what I think I came to was the idea that and certainly I'm really interested in what Thierry Duve has to say around beauty and modern and avant-garde art. He has this idea, which I'll restate rather poorly, that prior to Duchamp, the artwork held up to you was asking you the question, do you think this is beautiful? And after Duchamp, the artwork that was held up to you is asking you the question, do you think this is art? Well, I think that we never really left the beautiful behind, partly because I think that I'm old-fashioned enough to, without being overly Kantian, to think that if something's beautiful, then maybe there is a kind of rightness about it. Now, that sounds like a scary kind of proposition, but I like to think that the aesthetic still has within it a sense of the possibility of the human or the possibility of the world that we can can consider we can encounter through our visual experiences. So I think that's the beauty part. And I would say harmony is maybe a little more of an everyday kind of experience. And so I think of harmony as actually probably more related to decorative arts and to the things that people like. And because I actually think harmonious artworks are sometimes not very interesting, but my hope is that through using beauty and using harmony in ways that are not easy, that I'm doing some work that maybe people will engage in that might have walked right past a work that seems overtly troubled.
The show also contains language, written language, and also sort of spoken and heard language. And I wonder how you're thinking of amplifying the idea of just visual by moving into what can be read and what can be heard.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think I may have told you that on some of the shaped pieces, and this still exists on occasion, there were little stamped words that I wanted to somehow, not inferentially, but directly reference the notion of kind of relationship between these objects. So in one case, one said my thought and the other said your thought in a very tiny text. So you wouldn't see the text until you came up close. And I became uncomfortable with that because it seemed a bit like the punchline or the punctuation. But I knew that those ideas around a kind of assertion that is meant to elicit a response was something that I was really, really interested in. And so I hoped that the shapes, the works themselves could begin to inferentially stand for those kinds of relationships. And then what I did was develop a script of many of those kind of sayings. One was an open question and a different question. And I put it into a script that I worked with Winja Lentz, the media artist, and we basically made what is almost like a spoken fugue of all of this language. And it seems to me that it suggests a kind of immersive experience of sound in relation to which these objects begin to potentially take on certain kinds of meanings that we might not have actually ascribed to them quite as directly. I hope that some of those meanings are there no matter what, but certainly the sound is meant to do some useful work in that regard.
Well, they're there, and it's as always with your work, it's layered and very rich. It's always good to talk to you about your work.
Thank you so much, Robert. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, thanks, Patrick.